Well, thank you, GW and the University of Ottawa, for the honor of presenting the Bromley Lecture. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak at an event named after Alan Bromley, and which counts as former lecturers, the past two U.S. presidential science advisors, John Marburger and John Holdren. So much of my career has been spent following the leadership of these three men. So I hope I proved myself worthy, both today and actually for the rest of my career. So bonjour et bonsoir. Merci à l'université pour l'honneur de vous parler aujourd'hui. J'étais sous l'administration du président Obama, directeur adjoint de la recherche et du développement fédéral at OSTP, Office of Science, Technology Policy, à la Maison-Blanche des États-Unis. Je voudrais vous proposer exemples et leçons apprises, pas leçons oubliées. Ça sera l'année 2018. OSTP, leçons apprises, et offrir des réflexions sur la science et la politique. And that concludes the entirety of my French top part of the talk. So I'm here today because I've made a career at the intersection of science and public policy. And I don't think of myself primarily as a science policy researcher or academic, and I don't think of myself as a science policy maker. The men that I worked for were the science policy makers. Instead, I'm a science policy practitioner. So today, I hope to be able to bring you some lessons from practice and practical thoughts on science and technology policy informed by my now 24 years working in science and technology policy. I like to be a storyteller and I show pictures. I'm not going to show you a lot of text, so don't worry, you won't be reading a lot. So although I've been in the field for 20 plus years, I'm speaking to you today, I know, because of 8 of those years. So I'm here because the entire time President Obama was in the White House, all 8 years, I was at the White House Office of Science, Technology Policy, or OSTP. There, I had the privilege of working for President Obama's Science and Technology Advisor, John Holdren, to do whatever we could through the US federal government's policies, laws, and funding to ensure that US science and engineering research and education remain strong and the best in the world. And we did that because we knew, and President Obama knew, that we could only meet all of the challenges that the United States faced in the economy, the environment, health, national security, and so many other areas, only if US science and engineering were strong and if we had talented STEM students and workers. So for 8 years, I was part of a team in the White House making change happen through science and technology policy. You won't find this at the White House website anymore. This is from the archives, from our national archives. So where did it all begin? I have been to Canada before, but this is my first time. Where is this? Yes. Yeah, because I grew up in Ohio. It was very easy for us to drive around either side of Lake Erie to get to Canada. So before I start talking about that experience, let me take you to a little bit before. So let me tell you about my science, because that's what scientists do. So I think of myself as a lapsed social scientist. So I study people. What kind of people? I study scientists as people. They are people too. And the policymakers who make decisions affecting them. So although I've wandered well away from research to practice, to the extent that I have a discipline, it's the science of science policy, which means studying the US science and engineering enterprise as a human enterprise with incentives, prejudices, foibles, customs, etc. So my part of that discipline has been the incentives and policies that shape our behavior as scientists and engineers working in this enterprise. And my specialization has been science funding policy, the dollar inputs that the US federal government feeds into the enterprise, and the outputs and outcomes that come out of that investment. And my lab has mostly been the Washington, D.C. science policy world. But for the last 8 years, I think I became the person that I used to study. And I was a policy practitioner at the heart of the federal government. So I know that many people here are students or early career professionals who are curious about career paths in science policy. So if I may, let me tell you a short story about how I got to where I got to. You heard the first part of that story, which is I was fortunate enough to study with Dr. Bernordis here at GW. I got a master's in international science and technology policy. To this audience, I don't have to say, you can get a degree in science policy because you know that. Other audiences, I tell them this. But after that, I spent most of my career, as you heard, at the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is where I was writing about, analyzing, putting together, taking apart US science funding policy. And that background is important because it was really at GW, perhaps not in Nick's class, but another class, where I was first introduced to Harvey Brooks' classification of science and technology policy as science and technology for policy and policy for science and technology. Since then, I've mostly lived that classification, and I've come to understand how useful that construct is in trying to understand science and technology policy. So this is how I'm going to organize my talk today. I will first talk about policy for science, and then I'm going to talk about science for policy. So what is policy for science? For me, that is the set of government actions, legislations, budgets, funding schemes, etc., that affect the US science and engineering research enterprise. It's the dollars that go into funding research and development in the United States. Now, in the United States, that is a considerable investment. That when I was at AAAS and also when I was in the White House, I was looking at a portfolio of roughly $140 billion a year in research and development, so R&D. Most of my attention, most of our collective attention was on the R part of it, the research investments that the federal government made. And that was roughly $70 billion a year. So basically my career is this slide of showing that federal funding for research has ups and downs. It is many colors, meaning that in the United States, there are 24 different federal departments and agencies that fund some research. You can really only see the largest colors here, but there are actually 24 of them. And so my job was at first to understand it and to document this. And then for the past 8 years, it was to help shape what that federal investment in research was going to be. How much was it going to be? Which agencies would make these investments? And most importantly, what kinds of research at what institutions the US government was going to support. So this is what I did in policy for science. And actually, it was this chart, or an earlier version of it, that got me to where I was going. So one of the things that happened was that after the November 2008 elections, the Obama transition team was looking for people to do science funding policy. Why? Because at that time, the incoming administration for President Obama realized that there was an opportunity but also a crisis. That was in the depths of the Great Recession. And it was at that time that the incoming administration was trying to put together the Recovery Act, which became known as the stimulus package. There was an opportunity there to, in addition to funding infrastructure of roads, etc., buildings, but also to invest in research, both research in laboratories and the laboratories themselves. So I was hired as part of the transition team to help put together the research investments that will go into the Recovery Act. Those research investments are that blip up that you see in 2009, by the way. It was also at that time, in December of 2008, that President Obama very wisely chose John Holdren to be his director of OSTP and science advisor. Now, that was a really good day, December 20th, because of course I knew John. John Holdren had been the president of AAAS. a few years earlier. And in his AAAS presidential address, he actually put this chart on the screen. And that chart and the article, the address, became an article in the journal Science. And that presidential address of John Holden was the one document that John said was on President Obama's desk when he went for a job interview. So my work was in that room. So I called him and said, John, when you get to OSTP, there's this job, Assistant Director for Federal R&D, that's all about federal research funding. So I hope you'll think of me when you decide to fill that job. He did, and so I went. So that is the short story of how I did that, so how I got to where I got. So I asked, he said yes, and the adventure began. So I joined the White House as one of the first crop of people going in, even before Dr. Holden was confirmed by the Senate in his role as OSTP director. So that is the inauguration. You know who those two are. The inaugural ball. We got to work the next day on making policy for science right away, and it was primarily through the Recovery Act. And so I immediately learned after that science policy is a contact sport. It requires a lot of people-to-people contact, and you also need a library. It's a contact sport with a library attached, because initially, to make these visions of increasing science funding into reality, it took talking with our Office of Management and Budget, the science agencies, my OSTP colleagues, other colleagues throughout the executive branch of government, with congressional staff, my former AAAS colleagues, scientists and engineers from all around the country. And to make the arguments for how we were going to increase federal research investments, we needed to turn to our libraries, because by that time we had a thick stack of reports from our National Academy of Sciences, from transition memos, white papers that had been given to us during the transition, my AAAS analyses, president's budgets, Obama campaign documents, etc. All of that was needed to shape the first few policy documents that came out of the Recovery Act. And then, after February 17th of that year, to implement it, to spend the $20 billion for R&D that was in the Recovery Act, and in the regular funding bills that followed. So in the midst of these early days, one of my new colleagues said to me, you know what, I figured out that OSTP is a community organizer. And our community is the S&T and technology community. So that insight helped me a lot, so I became a community organizer. So that is why we had all these contacts, meetings, and of course information coming out of those meetings that we documented and we tried to write down and use in policy making. You know, another lesson that I learned was that policy rollouts are important. Now rollout, that word, verb, noun, was not a part of my vocabulary before the White House. But I learned, just as BlackBerry, by the way, was not until I got there. And now it no longer is anyway, so I'm sorry. But I learned to use the word rollout and recognize how important it was. You know, policies might be government actions that are embodied in documents, such as legislation or reports. But crafting a policy was never sufficient. Policies have to be announced, pushed out into the world, and set on a path to action. That's why rollout, the act of pushing policies out into the world, was so important. So let me tell you about my first big rollout of several big policies for science. Let's see, that's not it. There it is. So I give my S&T Policy Cornerstone students at GW the assignment of reading President Obama's April 27, 2009 speech to the National Academy of Sciences. In other pictures of the event, you can see the back of my head in the second row. It was an important time because you see the date. It was within the first 100 days of President Obama taking office. He was the first president since John F. Kennedy to speak to the academies in his first 100 days in office. And there is nothing like a US president in his first 100 days in office, when public attention is at its highest, using the power and visibility of a historic presidency to roll out policies for science and technologies. Now, normally, we would have taken our time to craft policies and release them as they were ready. But when the president agreed to give a major science speech at the end of April, we realized we could not waste that opportunity to announce policies with a big bang, with maximum impact and staying power. So in the first few months of that administration, there was a mad rush to have a package of policies to announce. Because just a few words in a president's speech can make all the difference. We packed that speech, which read for about 35 minutes, with content, with goals, with visions and policies. Behind every phrase and sentence, including several I wrote, were dollars, documents, meetings, workshops, phone calls, and more meetings. Just as an example, or just to use one example, that ARPA-E was a science agency that for the United States government that was launched as a result of that speech. ARPA-E was an idea to have an advanced research project agency for clean energy be a new dedicated agency within our Department of Energy to invest in breakthrough approaches for clean energy technologies. This was an idea that had been around since 2006. It had been authorized, that is, given a blueprint by our Congress in 2007. But for years after that, no funding had appeared, so it was not, the blueprint was just that, a blueprint. Then in the Recovery Act of February, the Recovery Act contained $400 million to launch this thing for which there was a blueprint. So in 2 months, between February and April, we had a mad rush to try to launch this new agency. So although in that speech, President Obama opened the doors of ARPA-E, really there was not a door. At that day, ARPA-E was a PDF on a website, which was the initial solicitation for proposals from the community of clean energy projects. There was no one. It had 0 employees. And in fact, we had not even figured out how these proposals that were about to come in would be peer reviewed. That was still to come. But we had to take advantage of this opportunity to launch it with a big bang. And at that time, he also, in addition to launching things, he also had an applause line in there. Only the National Academy of Sciences, we're going to invest 3% of our GDP in research and development via an applause line. But anyway, that was the applause line. That phrase, just saying that the United States will have a goal of reaching 3% of US R&D GDP, would guide us, haunt us, and drive us for years to come. Because once the president articulates that as a goal, we used it. We used that as a hook to hang all sorts of policy proposals. Because for years afterward, we would come up with ways to increase federal research funding, and we say, if we do this, we're going to get a little bit closer to that goal of 3%. Now, there is really no magic to 3%, except that at that time and now, it is just above what the United States is investing. So it was an ambitious but achievable goal, something that could realistically be achieved by a combination of policies, both for the federal sector and also incentives for the private sector, because the private sector then and now is actually responsible for 2/3 of the total US R&D investment. It was a goal that we hoped he would say so that we could then make policy for years to come. And we came up with ideas for that. It helped us to do things like pressing for a planned doubling of 3 science agencies' budgets. So I used my chart-making skills and color skills to put together proposals for how we would increase funding for the National Science Foundation and 2 other US science agencies. The long story short, it did not happen. We tried. Year after year, we kept trying and pushing that forward. But Congress, our US Congress had other ideas and never appropriated the full amount of funding. So that effort fell off track. And so the bottom line, 2017, those budgets are not double what they were a decade ago. But that speech to me was an early clue that policy is about more than laws, legislation, regulations, and other documents. So what is policy? To me, it's government action that makes some change in the world. And so I learned, science policy is more than documents. In fact, events, speeches, workshops, even tweets, are also science policy because they are vehicles for change. And sometimes it was frustrating because I felt like we were an event planning office rather than a science policy office, because we had 6 White House science fairs, a White House Maker Fair, annual visits to the Oval Office by US Nobel Prize winners, Kavli Prize winners, early career awards for scientists and engineers, presidential awards for scientific mentoring, White House Astronomy Night, 2 of them, White House annual events for science and math teachers in the United States, events in the White House East Room for the Brain Initiative or for embryonic stem cell research, and so many other things. And of course, workshops, career fairs, movie screenings, seminars, learning sessions, and so much more. Even science at the White House Easter egg roll. That's the picture, because there is science in rolling eggs. So why were we doing this? Because science policy is about using all the tools you have to create change in the world. So one of my favorite phrases at OSTP was and remains, what's in your toolkit? For me, my toolkit expanded beyond the tools I thought I had, budget charts, spreadsheets, etc., the things I've showed you so far, to a far broader toolkit. And I also learned to look for tools that only I had. So the tools we had that other people didn't was simply the White House, the building, and the president and the vice president. We use those tools continually to bring people to the White House, sometimes to meet the president, sometimes not, because bringing people together at the White House created change in the world. It created partnerships and alliances that wouldn't have happened otherwise. And it added the president's power to persuade and inspire to the mix of legislation, documents, etc., to ensure that the policies that the administration articulated would endure in the world and in the lives of the people that we were able to touch. So going back to the National Science Foundation example, my part was primarily about funding, making sure that NSF was able to give 2,000 graduate research fellowships a year and finding money within the federal budget to do that. But to that policy and funding mix, we tried to add, and the President Obama wanted to add, a president saying that America needs you, needs students. And he wanted to personally encourage girls, especially, and also boys and girls of color, to pursue and stay with STEM studies. Because until you see someone like you, who looks like you, doing science, whether it's firing a cannon or looking through a telescope, you may not think that science is for you. And that was the value of White House science fairs and other events. And to that policy and funding, also add bringing groups together. We brought federal science agencies together with universities and their faculty and with STEM students to build partnerships in order to guarantee that our policies were a success. We did that a lot. Educate to Innovate, Startup America, the Advanced Manufacturing Partnership. For so many efforts, we recognize that, of course, the U.S. science and engineering enterprise is so big and so distributed that federal government alone and federal policies alone could not make change on the scale that we thought we needed. So we had to use our tools to create lasting partnerships. One example of that, the primary tool that we used to create change in the world from outside the federal government was something we called commitments. Now, what's a commitment? A commitment is a pledge from someone else to do something. to commit to some action in science and technology policy. So is a commitment federal policy? Not really. It's non-federal organizations committing their resources, their people, and their capabilities to some broader effort. So why did so many organizations make these commitments? Because in part of the tools that we deployed, a place on a White House fact sheet, an invitation to the White House, and a White House convened chance to meet with industry, government, nonprofit, and school partners they would not have otherwise met to make progress together on solving a science technology challenge. So science policy is not only a contact sport with the library, but it's also a team sport that requires the creative use of all of these tools that are available. And that was not easy for me to learn and do because I was a one-man program at AAAS in doing R&D budget analysis. I also learned a little bit about time. I learned that to think about the long game because policies take a lot of time. And one example that I like to use is President Obama in his first inaugural address in January of 2009 said, "We will restore science to its rightful place." That's all we said, but the US scientific community knew what he meant. It meant undoing some of the restrictions on communication that were placed on federal scientists during the Bush administration. And he followed that up with a presidential memorandum on scientific integrity that provided guidance to federal agencies for how they would protect the scientific integrity of federal scientists. And then we at OSTP were tasked with following that up with detailed guidance on how agencies will make sure that scientific integrity will be protected for we hoped, forever. And that memorandum actually took even longer, till December of 2010. I know in Canada, you have also dealt with that issue under the previous government, so you understand that it takes a long time. So the punchline is, it took so long that the last thing that I posted on the OSTP blog, December 19th, 2016, 8 years later, that was when we were finally able to say 24 federal agencies have policies in place intended to be permanent to protect the ability of federal scientists to speak freely about their results and to have review over the way results are used in policymaking. So scientific integrity policies, an 8-year journey. And I could tell much the same story and the same time frame about advanced manufacturing or public access to scientific results. So, scientists, I found, should know this. We should know this because research takes a long time. Research takes many years from hypothesis to experiment to publishing and revision. But politicians often forget because they are used to 2 or 4 or 6 year time frames. But what I learned was, if you are patient, if you use the water on stone approach, having droplets of water every so often, you can actually cause the stone to erode and you can make progress. You can clear the way. Now let me turn to the second part of my talk, transitioning from policy for science to science for policy. Over the last several years, I've witnessed a lot of debates and activity around the world on the role of scientific advice in policymaking at the highest levels of national governments. During my time in the White House, I came to appreciate how unique the US system is for science policy. Of all the nations that I came into contact with, the United States is the only national government that combines the roles of a science advisor and a research minister. That is, it's the only nation in which one office and at the top, one person does both policy for science and also science for policy. So what's important about offering scientific advice, that is the science for policy, bringing the latest and best available scientific information to policy issues that are outside the strict science and technology world? Well, to quote a famous musical, Hamilton, which I had the honor of seeing with President Obama a few years ago, I was in the balcony, he was in the orchestra. I want to be in the room where it happens. The room where it happens is not only the catchiest song that you will ever hear about why Washington, D.C. is the nation's capital. It's also the place where science should be. So I'm convinced that science should be in the room where it happens, in the White House, because of my experiences there. So where does it happen? Where are these rooms? It is in the building where I used to work, which is the Eisenhower Executive Office building, which you see here, 2 blocks from GW's Elliott School, which made it easy to, by the way, to go teach classes and then come back. So what you see here is this monstrosity from the 19th century that houses the majority of White House staff. On the left, you see the residence where the president lives. And in between, in this valley between them, is the Oval Office and the West Wing where the president and his most senior White House staff work. So every other community recognizes that it's important to be close to the president when decisions are made. That's why the National Security Council, the National Economic Council, the Domestic Policy Council, and so on are all in this building where I worked, because decisions get made in rooms in that building, or in the West Wing, or in the Oval Office. And you can bet that security advice, economic advice, political advice are all represented in those rooms. And time again, I was witness to the importance of science advice being a part of those rooms. If we think about all the crises needing US government responses over the last 8 years, whether it was the Deepwater Horizon oil disaster, the Fukushima nuclear disaster, the hacking of millions of people's government information and databases, including my information, the Ebola epidemic, and in this case, the Zika epidemic. Think of the scientific content just in those disasters, not to mention the less urgent but no less important need to incorporate the best available scientific information in policies for cybersecurity, combating climate change, improving healthcare, and so on. So in just about every policy issue that a US administration and a president confront, there is scientific and technical content. And in the Obama administration, you had a presidential science advisor, that's him, over there, next to the National Economic Council head and the head of the Office of Management Budget. You had a presidential science advisor and often others at OSTP in every room where policy decisions were made. But of course, it's not just about being in the room. It's bringing the science into that room. Having a science advisor close to the president turned out to be important not only for the access, but also access to the science, not just access to the president, but the access to the science. Because when we were there, we had to have the information and the evidence. At times, such as in the height of the Zika epidemic, the situation was changing daily on the ground, and also in our scientific understanding of things like vector control and mosquito control, etc. So we had to be in meetings like this every day. So it was a good thing we were down the hall and we could be there. But it was also a mad scramble because we had to offer the best available advice. Now, how were we accessing that scientific information in real time? As staff, we did literature searches. We consulted academies' reports and other reports. We talked to our federal scientist colleagues. But I came to realize the power of being able to call any scientist in the United States, right up to Nobel laureates, and say, the president's science advisor needs a memo by tomorrow because he is meeting with the president tomorrow on an issue. And so no matter how busy they would drop everything to bring the best available scientific information to the president. And it even worked for me. As you might guess, most of my work at OSTP was on the policy for science side, but I was also involved in science for policy as well. I usually provided advice on the policy side of a science issue, such as, how much is the federal government investing in Zika research? Which agencies and which programs are making those investments? Or what do the data say about the science and technology workforce for an area that we are considering? What are the economic and political considerations of that issue? So I would bring my world of federal R&D and other S&T data, federal budgets, economics, and political science to bear, alongside my colleagues who would bring disciplinary knowledge, deep knowledge of agencies, and also other forms of knowledge. But I too called people at the National Science Foundation of Academies and asked them to drop everything because I needed information for a memo for the president. And time after time, they responded. And I can tell you that is not going to work for me anymore now that I wish I could share some of those memos with you, but they won't be public until later on in the Obama Presidential Library. But when that opens, you'll be able to see them. Oh well. Now this is where, of course, I have to remind everyone that just because you're in the room doesn't mean that you're going to win. We all know this, but let me state it again. Science is an important input, and it deserves its place in the room. But science is only one input, and it's rarely the deciding factor. There are very few decisions where science alone gives you the right answer to a policy question. There are always politics, economics, values, priorities, etc. to be weighed. Science will give you options and likely outcomes, but it does not give you the right decision. So after that reminder, back to science for policy. So for science for policy, what was in my toolkit? A good library and knowledge networks, yes, but primarily people in the right places who are willing to provide their expertise. My tools to reach these people were reading the reports, calling them, emailing them, meeting with them, bringing them to the White House, and finding some ways to reward them. I didn't have many rewards to give, by the way, because we didn't have any funding to give. I had some M&Ms with the presidential seal on them. They were powerful. Also, I could bring them for West Wing tours and White House tours. But I had a variety of relationships to be able to get these people into the right rooms and to enable their science to be turned into policy, to be turned into action. What tools didn't I have? As I said, I had to be creative and resort to things like White House tours because I did not have a lab. There are no labs in that building. There's no research funding in our building because OSTP's budget was $5 million a year at the end. So those are some of my lessons learned on science for policy. But in the United States, the structure that I've just described is not settled. So some members of Congress and some Washington organizations have questioned whether the president needs a science advisor in the White House, and whether instead scientific advice could be provided by the National Science Foundation or by universities or by the national academies or other such organizations. Well, I think that's a bad idea, and I think you recognize why I think that's a bad idea, because the importance of being able to be in the room where decisions are made. External organizations just cannot do that. So that's why I joined my former boss, John Holder, in saying President Trump should have a science advisor, and soon. Though I'm a little bit more cautious than he is, because I would rather have no science advisor than a really bad one. But be that as it may. So in recent years, other nations have also been exploring the role of science for policy in their national governments. And the trend is, as you know, here in Canada, towards strengthening science advice at the highest levels of government. Please do not look too much at this slide. This is one colleague from Japan's attempt to map how governments get scientific advice, both in a nation and multilaterally and bilaterally. But my colleagues and I were visited by government officials from Australia, Japan, Singapore, European nations, and yes, Canada, all of whom were interested in how the United States provides scientific advice to the president and how that advice is integrated into policymaking. And other nations have explored this link in parallel. The European Union, for example, has experimented with how EU officials in Brussels should receive scientific advice and have gone back and forth from having a chief scientific advisor to the president of the European Commission to disbanding that post to establishing in its place in 2015 a high-level advisory group of 7 scientists, along with some enhanced relationships between the Commission and European National Academies of Science. You in Canada, of course, have been rethinking your government's mechanisms for obtaining science advice since the Trudeau government came to power. I'm well aware that in late December, Canada launched its nationwide search for a Chief Science Advisor of Canada who will be responsible for providing scientific advice to the Prime Minister and to members of Cabinet. How's that going, by the way? You haven't found one, have you? No, okay. And I know that that person will be the second to hold that role after there was a previous one for a couple of years in the 2000s. I think you can tell that I think that is a great idea. And I also think that in the Canadian system, it is probably necessary to have this Chief Science Advisor separate from the research or innovation ministers, because your parliamentary system of government is perhaps not ideal for having them be the same person. But it's a great concept, because I do think both of those functions are important to have in the highest levels of government. Japan has been grappling with this scientific advice to government issue too, particularly since 2011, in the aftermath of the Great East Japan earthquake, when the Japanese government was roundly criticized for lacking a strong and independent scientific advisory capacity for the national government. At a time when science for policy was truly a life or death situation. Over the years, Japan has discussed creating a chief scientific advisor to the Prime Minister, but so far they have not settled on that post. As one step, Japan created the post of a science advisor to the Foreign Minister, similar to the science advisor to our U.S. Secretary of State. And that institution has existed for nearly 2 decades in the United States, and we think it's a useful model for how other nations should be advised in science and diplomacy. So we're happy that Japan is creating that post. So in all these examples and more, I'm happy that we've had a long period of nations learning from one another and finding better mechanisms for connecting science to policy through mechanisms for offering high-level scientific advice. I'm going to skip over that part, and just talk a little bit more about some of these decisions based on science. So this is the R&D priorities memo that I authored each year on behalf of OSTP and OMB. This is an annual memo that was started by Alan Bromley when he was George Bush Sr.'s OSTP director. So I'm very grateful to him for starting this thing, which I tried to carry on. So I can admit it now that I'm out. When I was writing these memos, I was not relying on evidence. I was on data or on science. This is the dirty secret that I'm sharing here. It was priorities memos for R&D remained primarily political documents. Part of the reason is I didn't have the tools, the data, the science needed to write a more scientific priorities memo. And part of the reason, of course, is that science itself doesn't give you priorities, because priorities are about values. So ironically, although I think the Obama administration was successful in bringing science into the room for non-science issues, it was not so successful in bringing science into the room for some science decisions, such as science funding. And that, I think, is one of the regrets that I have, is that one of the things that I wanted to do going in was to honor Dr. Marburger's legacy. Dr. Marburger was President George W. Bush's science advisor and OSTP director. And he really founded this field that I call my own of the science of science policy. He wanted data, tools, evidence to enable science policy decision makers to make more scientific decisions about science. So he did that. He created a program, a research program and a community of practice, but we didn't make as much progress as we would like. We have more data today in order to make these decisions. But I see a failure of the US government
as a demand side problem, in that policymakers don't demand more evidence and data and more science about science, because decisions about science policy get made anyway. Budgets have to get formulated each year. Policy decisions in response to crises have to get made. Even no one is going to stop and say, oh, we're not making that decision until we have all the evidence that we need. They have to do that. And I admit I'm guilty of that because I helped to move around millions, if not billions of dollars inside agency science budgets and between agencies. Did I have all the information that I needed? No. Did I have all the research that I needed? No. Because we were not able to make advancing science policy through science more of a reality of the administration. That said, I think there were some successes. And as a result of my time at the White House, I think I've come to a new vision for how science policy might work and should work. In so many ways, I see opportunities for us to move toward stronger connections between science for policy and policy for science in a feedback loop in which one reinforces the other. So, my vision is one in which policy for science, such as funding, dollars for science, results in research that results in new knowledge that helps inform better decision making in the science for policy. But of course, once you make policy, more questions arise, more opportunities, science that we don't know, technological options that we don't have, which means you need more policy again to fund more research, different research, to answer the questions that come up. So in an ideal world, I think we will be able to get this feedback loop going of research resulting in answers, resulting in more questions, resulting in more research, etc. But I think you can see from what I've talked about and from this vision that I see value in having a single organization that is equally adept at science advice for policy and also policy making for science. And because most of us did both, depending on what time of day it was. And sometimes we did it simultaneously. So this time plot actually shows, it shows in graphical form my colleagues. So at the end of the Obama administration, we were 100 plus at the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And our pictures are all over on the bottom. And our names and the things we worked on are on the bottom. And then these are the people and how long they lasted. So most of my colleagues were federal civil servants or university professors who joined OSTP for a year or two on loan from their universities or from their agencies or companies. I'm toward the bottom because I ran all the way through, but most of my colleagues I was fortunate enough to be able to work with for a year or two, and then they went back to where they came from. And that was very useful for us because they brought to us all these connections. They could call back to NASA, or they could call back to their university when we had questions about either policy or scientific evidence. So that is, I think, an organization that worked pretty well in not only circulating people, but also circulating science for policy, policy for science in that feedback loop that I talked about. So I'm trying to do the same at AAAS now, and wherever I go, to try to make sure that that feedback loop operates and that we can access the people and the talent to make that possible. So I am, proud to have been a part of an organization that tried to build this kind of feedback loop in the White House and succeeded, and brought both science for policy and policy for science to the heart of US government policy making. So that's what I've tried to talk to you about today, about policy for science and the tools that I learned to use to do that. About science for policy and some of the tools that I've learned to use to do that. And I also reflected on the importance of having a policy toolkit and knowing the tools that one can and cannot use to solve problems. And I tried to do it in the context of reflecting on what might turn out to be like the peak of my career in a wild 8-year ride that I'm still recovering from. But all good things must come to an end, so that is, of course, the last day. There's a lot that I have not talked about deliberately. I've not talked much about the new US administration. I haven't talked about my personal high points and low points, and my contributions outside of the science technology policy sphere. Maybe we can talk about that later on. But you can ask me that in the discussion, but thank you very much for listening and for being here to talk about science and technology and public policy.